thanks for watching. Real quick, Never Pay Again membership as well as the Merkabah catalog is ending soon. Make sure you guys take advantage of that this weekend. It will be gone by Monday. Yeah, thanks to everybody who supported on that. Also, remember Frequency and Vibration Part 3 is out, as well as the Guide of 2025. A lot of questions I got answered in those videos, so make sure you guys take advantage. Also, again, flash drives going out. People who ask about the Never Pay Again membership on Merkabah Academy, we're updating the site right now, so if you see a little confusion on the site, it's because it's being upgraded, adding some new stuff, more courses, and just some new things. It's going to be cool. You guys will see in a second. But yeah, upgrading the site. When we get to the site, remember, Never Pay Again members, make sure you guys go to the Never Pay Again membership section. In that section, you can go to the video catalog or the video section, and you can find all of the DVDs there. All the digital downloads are there. You can click on it, and it'll take you over to, you can see those videos. So I keep in that site only the last, I think 12 or 15 videos that release, I keep on that channel. That way it keeps bandwidth down. I don't have to, put so much space on the site. So you can see those last 15 will be right there. The newest video, of course, will be up top. And we're going to start putting that up there, the next new video. So this last one is only for purchase only. So make sure you guys grab it because, a lot of people who had Never Pay Again membership end up buying it. So I don't want to put it out because it's not fair to those guys. So if you want to see those last two, grab them. Check the link, sent to you guys in an email for only $9.99. But the next DVD will be on that page at the top. So make sure you guys check for that. But it's probably going to be a different, well, it's for sure going to be a different platform. It's going to look a lot different. So yeah, a lot of people checked out the presidential debate. People asking my opinion on that whole thing. Of course, you guys already know I don't get into that bull crap. All that stuff is just a blanket for people who still believe in politics and believe in these politicians. But yeah, of course, Trump saying, black jobs, Hispanic jobs. It's a crazy thing. He should have worded that differently. But yeah, all that is just getting people to have conversations about what he said. The black people who have now jumped onto the Trump bandwagon are, scratching their heads right now. But I mean, to keep it real, I understand exactly what he meant. And, it's not a big deal just to keep people talking. But, what exactly is black jobs? And anything that's saying black jobs has to be a derogatory way, because it's like, if you say specifically black, that's what you mean, or specifically Hispanic, that's what you mean. So please elaborate more on what is a black job or a Hispanic job, if you understand. He should have worded it differently, But yeah, it is what it is, just to keep the whole wheel going and people talking about the whole situation. But yeah, of course, we know how old are you guys? 30s, 40s? Same stuff every year, every 4 years. Politics, politics, politics. We're going to change this. We're going to do that. Nothing ever changes. The history of it is crazy that people are still following this crap. I can't believe it. So it's the perfect segue into our ancient history series rundown, which we're getting into in this video. And just me going in and out of the series and just put some things there that people need to understand about this history. It's a lot. But yeah, I wanted to quick update. A lot of stuff happening, a lot of stuff going on. I'm putting out a lot of videos and keeping you guys updated as I go. So yeah, you'll see a big change to the site coming soon, Merkabah Academy. And again, make sure you guys take advantage of that Merkabah Academy membership. Never Pay Again. It's going to be gone by Monday for sure, as well as the catalog. So make sure you guys grab it. It's going to go back to $2,000 come Monday because that's what it's worth, to be honest, at least that. So yeah, take a look at the video for you guys who haven't seen it. For you guys who have seen the whole ancient history series, rewatch it. A lot of information. Thanks for watching. Let's get into the videos. You think about the Genesis story. You get the creation of the heavens and earth and, planets or what have you. But what is missing? And what's missing is the war, the fall of Satan. What exactly happened? Why is that story missing from Genesis? It should be there. It's the reason why we found it in Ezekiel and Isaiah. And it's, so far from the Genesis story. This is supposed to have happened before Adam and Eve, but it should be there. But this also tells you that there's a gap. There's a time gap. There's a lot of time missing. If God created the heavens and the earth and, all of a sudden we get man, we get Adam and Eve, there is some time missing. What's going on? Then all of a sudden, Satan shows up in the garden. There's a lot of time missing. And it's a reason why, they put it that way. So when you get to Ezekiel, and you start reading about the story in Ezekiel 28. You start reading from 1 to 13 we'll go to. Well, matter of fact, we'll go from 11 to 13, keep it kind of short. But when you start reading in Ezekiel 13:1, it's talking about, he's talking to Tyre, to the king of Tyre. As a matter of fact, he's talking to the prince. That's another thing you got to understand translations in a lot of the versions. In some translation, it translates into prince in most of them, but in some, it translates into king, or what have you. So, just be mindful of that. It don't matter in any case, but just understand that he could possibly be talking to the king in the beginning and the king, when they're speaking to Satan. So you'll understand in a second. But it starts out with Ezekiel basically speaking to the prince of Tyre or Tyrus. Understand Tyre is Tyrus, same thing. Get into that. And he's talking to him and basically telling him that God is condemning him for basically, claiming to be a god. So he's basically condemning the prince of Tyre or Tyrus for claiming to be a god. And then as you go on, you realize that, he's starting to talk to the king of Tyrus. And basically what he's explaining to the king, fits the story of Satan. This is one of the things you got to understand. When you start getting into the story of Satan, it's confusing. It's confusing, and you'll see in a second. So we read here, Ezekiel 28, 11 through 13. It says, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up lamentations upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou seatest up the sum, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God." Think about that. "Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold, the workmanship of thy tabrets," which tabrets are these things right here, "and of thy pipes were prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created." So it starts out with him speaking to the king of Tyrus. So clearly, and what he's saying cannot pertain to him, but it's talking to him. But we know for damn well this man wasn't in the Garden of Eden. We know that this human man can't have, these jewels built into his being. So we understand this verse is to be talking about Satan. A lot of scholars are in disagreement on the verses and what it actually means. Some people think that, it's, him trying to basically compare what the king of Tyrus is doing to what Satan did. That doesn't fit. A lot of scholars believe that the king of Tyrus was possessed by Satan, which makes a lot more sense. But when you read it, they seem to be coupling Satan with this man. Think about that. Why are they making a comparison? Why is it coupling Satan with this man? It's not being definitive and saying what's exactly going on. Is this dude possessed by Satan? Are you talking about Satan, which clearly he has to be? Who else was in the garden? Nobody else but Adam, Eve, the serpent, God. Definitely wasn't this dude. So what's going on? But we see this coupling of this story of Satan with the man. We see it again in Isaiah. So we read Isaiah 14, 12 through 16 says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nation? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms?" Did you pick up on that? It said, "Is this the man that made the earth to tremble?" That basically brought down the kingdoms. Is this the man? See, a lot of people, when they think about Satan, we hear him referred to as, the serpent, the dragon, the beast, Lord of the things that fly, Lord of the air, what have you. A lot of people don't conceive man, because when you say the word man, you think of man, mortal man. So how could this man be Satan? How could Satan be a man? Satan's supposed to be an angel, Lucifer, the light bringer, what have you. So when you look at the verse, it's clearly saying, is this the man? So when scholars look at this, they say, well, it can't be talking about, Satan. Satan's not man. I mean, it's clearly saying the man here.
That word is not a misinterpretation in the ancient manuscripts. It says man. So what is it talking about? Again, coupling Lucifer, Satan, with man. What's going on? Why is it making this comparison? And you will have to stop and think. If Satan is not a man, if he is to bring down the nations, the only way he can do it is if he get man to do it.
Remember, in the 1880s, they took out about 15 books from the Bible. And in those 15 books, you had Maccabees, 1 and 2. And you can find them in the Catholic Bible, but in the King James Version, we went for a long time without having Maccabees and 14 other books of the Bible. So when you start to realize that in Maccabees, it's getting into Alexander and the Ptolemies. So when you start to understand the history, when you start to read Daniel, you can look in Daniel and see that in Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies, although in the King James Version, they don't really elaborate on names. You'll get Darius, you'll get Alexander and Maccabees, but not in the King James Version itself. So the whole point is we really have to look at biblical history to see the reason why they kept the Ptolemies out and what all that is really talking about.
Now, it's crazy because there's no way you can be an historian or a researcher and go back in that time and look at the fact that before Kemet fell, you don't see the Greeks, really dressing like the Egyptians and all that stuff that we've seen that I showed you guys from the museum. You don't see all that stuff until after the conquest. So it's as if, they was watching and waiting, really being jealous and really waiting to go in there and to be like the Egyptians and have that knowledge. And it seems like, once they took it, they really embellished themselves within that information and really got a lot out of it. But history wise, when you go into the Bible, again, there's no way you can have these stories about these ancient times and not mention Alexander. You will not see Alexander mentioned in the King James Version, which is the authorized version. This is the version that they gave us. This is important to understand about the King James Version, how you can't just be, crazy with it and just off look it. You have to really accept this version and why it was given to us, because there's a lot behind it. So when you realize that it does not speak of Alexander in the King James Version, it speaks of Darius, but we don't see nothing about the Ptolemies or Alexander in the King James Version. And as I mentioned before, you have to really know about the Ptolemies if you're talking about biblical history, because they play a huge role. So, as I said, they took out the Apocrypha, or what they call the Deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha, which is, about 15 books that basically was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the King James Version until about, the 1880s when they took it out. Just all of a sudden took out all of these books, and they said that they wasn't really, as close to the other books, meaning they wasn't as divinely inspired as the other books of the Bible. So they removed them. Now, what makes that suspect and why this is important is because you have Maccabees, which we're going to get into first, Maccabees, which is where it's talking about Alexander. It's talking about the Ptolemies. It's talking about that time. Now, when you read Daniel, as I was talking about before, it's also talking about the Ptolemies and Alexander, but it does not mention their names, which is really suspect. It's, what's going on. So you can see how, as I showed you in part 1, we found the history. We went back and looked at the fact that the Bible's history, talking about what was going on with the Phoenicians in Tyre, what was going on in those lands during that time, and what really happened when Alexander came in there and destroyed that city. We see the actual proven history differs from what it's talking about in biblical history. They don't even mention Alexander, but we know that whole story has to do with him, but it's not in your Bible. But we can see that they clearly is talking about the same thing. And I showed you in part 1 how they mixed it up, how when we go back and find that the hidden meaning is actually telling you who would come into those lands and conquer it. So you see how they switch it up. It's the same thing. So what a lot of religious people do is they go in, they read the Bible, and the ones who do know history understand about the Ptolemies. So a lot of people pick up on the stories and say, you know what, they're talking about the Ptolemies, even though they don't mention them by name. The issue with that is if you don't go and look at actual history, a lot of people are believing that the story the Bible is putting out is actually real history, when that's not the case. The case is if you do not look at actual history and what many historians have, agreed upon, then compare it to the Bible, you won't get the truth. And the more you understand about how much, the Greeks conquered and what they did, it's an insult. And we don't realize it's an insult because we don't know history. We don't know what really took place, and we don't really get it. So we just go with the flow and what we have been brainwashed to believe as far as biblical history. But when you understand, it's how can you not put them in there? But in our Apocrypha, in First Maccabees, says clear as day. It's talking about Alexander. So it says here, this history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers, and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen, who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. So this is how we understand how Ptolemy I Soter became king of Egypt, who Ptolemy I Soter was one of his generals. And you start to really understand what was going on around that time. So the reason why, we mention Game of Thrones in this part is because when we go through this, you're going to understand where they got the whole entire concept from. I mean, when you start reading about this time and this history and what was going on between these generals, between these people who split up these kingdoms and had different lands, you see Game of Thrones. I mean, everything that you see, if you watch Game of Thrones, you're really going to understand this. Everything that you see and what's taking place in Game of Thrones is here. The only thing that is missing is dragons, but not really. Not really. Because when you start to understand that in Daniel, it's talking about dragons, as I pointed out, but also in the Apocrypha, we have Maccabees where it's talking about Alexander getting into the Ptolemies, but also part of the Apocrypha, you have the whole story about Bel and the dragons. And in Bel and the Dragons is talking about Daniel, which how fitting is talking about Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies. So you do have dragons. And as you get into the story, you're going to have female warriors and you're going to have, the same terminology about king of the north, king of the south, the kingdoms, bending the knee. All of this terminology you hear, you read about when it's talking about ancient Greece and the Ptolemies and everything that happened in the wars of the Diadochi and what took place. It's nowhere around that. Game of Thrones is talking about the Ptolemaic Empire, the Diadochi War, and what was going on back then. Plain and simple. It's nowhere around that to me. The whole thing about Ptolemy being a bastard, same thing with Game of Thrones, all that kind of talk is in the stories when you start reading and getting into it. And as we get into it, you're going to see what I'm talking about, and you can start to point out things. If you're into Game of Thrones, you'll understand exactly what it's saying. So now understand, we're going to get into the story. Now, when Alexander died, of course, the best thing to do, even though he split up the whole territory, started splitting up the kingdoms. And the best thing to do is to try to really take his spot. Everybody knew that when Alexander died, the person who took his spot will be looked at as the true ruler.
You've seen the first 2 volumes, of course, by now. You see how this is going. We basically taken it from where the Egyptians was, conquered, and you had the empire taken over by the Greeks and everything that transpired after that. Because when you start looking at history, everything takes place after the fall of Kemet. We see the rise of the European powers. We see the Renaissance and everything like that leading up to, what we know today. But this is where they established this faulty history, and it's biblical, the so-called biblical history that is false. So when you go back into antiquity and you can start tracing from the time when the Egyptian empire fell, what the Greeks was doing and what these people they are talking about in the Middle East, in Egypt or what have you, what was going on with the so-called Jews, the Greeks and the Romans and everything that was happening with the wars of the Diadochi and everything like that. What took place? Because it's in this time that we can uncover the truth. It's in this time that we can see exactly what took place and how they was able to, push in this history. And that's exactly what they did. You have the truth and you have this history that they made up. And what they did was, as I showed you guys, they basically piggybacked off of real Greek history and been able to basically show what the Greeks was doing in the wars of the Greeks, that, there's actual proof of these wars, and then basically put themselves in the Greek shoes, but as Jews. So all these so-called wars that the Jews was fighting is talking about in Genesis and everything like that, that supposedly the Jews was going out and conquering and fighting and everything. But when you go and look for that, you're going to see evidence of war, but not of the Jews. So as I showed you guys, it's really the Greeks talking about themselves and their wars and their battles that they had, along the way. This is what this is about. So when you get that aspect of it, it's still a lot of things that they have to explain and put in place. One of the major things will be, first of all, how is it that you had Hellenization going on, the Greeks going around instilling all these beliefs and conquering everything, and basically, as I showed you with the wars of the Diadochi, how they divided up the land. So how we have this going on in Hellenization in process, but for some reason, these Jews are allowed to practice Judaism. What is that? So this is how you really start to pay attention and reveal what really took place. Because you have in ancient Kemet, we know when it took over, I showed you guys at the museum, Serapis, Zeus Ammon, and all these so-called Greek guys, that everything that they instill in Egypt to try to get the Egyptians to believe. But when you get down to Israel, for some reason, they say, okay, you know what? We're going to take over, but we're going to let the Jews keep the religion and keep following it. What's up with that? And then we know later on, they would follow it themselves. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense for all this to be going on. And then somehow, everybody is just Jews. Christians, everybody following this doctrine of a people that's conquered by a stronger people, supposedly. So when you start looking at it from this point, you can see what took place. But when you start to really know the history and everything behind it, it starts to basically show you the truth, and it makes a lot more sense. So now, as I said, I talked about how they had to go out and make these people. They had to go out and make sure that they can create Jews. They had to create these Hebrews to explain this history, as I talked about in the books of the Bible series. I talked about that in edited Exodus and Leviticus. So definitely you want to see those. But understand, you got to create these people. They had to explain a lot of this history because there is no proof. So if you're going to be trying to interject these people into history, you got to explain certain things that don't make sense. Now, when you're a person that when you know about something and somebody comes and tries to talk about it, I mean, if you know everything about the situation, you can tell when they're lying. You can tell. It's like when somebody say they saw a movie and they can't really give you any parts of the movie. It's like, you ain't see that movie. Like, I can tell, I seen it. I don't know what you're talking about. So they have to try to cover for every single part. Every single scholar that's poking holes in the story is always a comeback. You ever see those real bad liars? They always got something, an excuse. They're always saying something to try to basically make up for their story sounding like bullshit. This is exactly what's happening with the antiquities of the Jews and their history. So it's a lot they have to explain and answer for. One of the things they got to explain, they have to tell us how, one, they was in Egypt in the 6th century BCE and how they disappeared. So first of all, one, you got to put yourself there and explain how are you there. And as I said, these people that are there are actually Greeks. And we're going to get into that in a second. But when you understand, when you start going back in history, how are you going to talk about one people and not the other, especially if this one group is supposed to be as glorious and huge as the Jews when you read the Old Testament. So when you have pharaohs and you have documentation of the Egyptians speaking of the Greeks and showing the Greeks, but no Jews, it's telling you, I mean, everything is giving you those connections right there that they were the Jews. That's who they're placing themselves to be. So they have to explain, one, how, because this is their claim, that the Babylonians came into Israel and basically took them into captivity into Babylon. Now, what they know is, they understand, and proof a show, that there were Assyrians. The Assyrians was coming into Kemet, and there was always these little wars and skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And the Assyrians would basically take over part of Lower Kemet. So this is them again trying to interject themselves during a period where there's war and stuff happen. Because then, it's chaos and stuff get lost, and you can't explain everything during a war because it's not going to be so much pieces. It's just going to be remnants of a war. But there's other stories to be told that's basically destroyed and covered up by war. They understand this. So they want to interject themselves into this period of time and say, well, I guess during this time, the Babylonians came in and basically took them. Just for some reason, they ain't want no Egyptians. They wanted to, for some reason, just take the Hebrews and take them all the way back to Babylon, these grown-ass men and women, and just enslave them for whatever reason. So this is what they claim, because they have to basically answer for the fact that they're not there during this war. During this time, when you had Samtek I, who Herodotus talks about, know he exists. This is Egyptian pharaoh. During this time, when Samtek is basically fighting the Assyrians, we're the Jews. If y'all was there, where are y'all? Greeks was there, but there's no mention of no Jews. And I understand this. So when you read here, it's saying, now this is the military campaign of Samtek. It says Samtek won Egypt's independence from the Assyrian Empire and restored Egypt's prosperity during his 54-year reign. The pharaoh proceeded to establish close relation with archaic Greece. Telling you right there, that connection, we know that was there. The hieroglyphics and everything I talk about with them showing the depictions of white men being there. So we know the Greeks was there. And also encouraged many Greek settlers to establish colonies in Egypt and serve in the Egyptian army. In particular, he settled some Greeks at Taphnis. So now don't let the whole thing fool you about the Assyrians. Understand the Assyrians, when they talk about the Assyrian Empire, it also includes the Babylonians and the Sumer and the Akkadians. You have the Egyptians successfully defeating the Assyrians, which we would assume would include Sumer, the Babylonians, and the Akkadians. Now, if they can defeat these people, why would they have a hard time or basically lose in the conquest from the Babylonians? Because see, they want you to believe that the Babylonians came into ancient Kemet, defeated the Egyptians, the Babylonians alone. We know there's supposed to have been skirmishes and wars, civil wars in Mesopotamia between the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and the Babylonians supposed to have won. And you got to understand that whole thing when you start seeing Babylonians. Of course, somebody's talking about something biblical. Assyrians, they're talking about historical stuff, because that's what, the name that they use, and they try to really differentiate between the two. But mostly when you see Babylon, it's dealing with something biblical. They always throw that in there to give that reference, because the Bible's talking about, Babylon, the Babylonians. So, it's tough to believe that they was able to defeat them when the Egyptians had already beaten the Assyrians in a larger army. So now, Nico II, Egyptian pharaoh, son of Samtek I, named after his father. He takes the throne 610 BCE. This is supposed to be around the time when the Babylonians come in and basically take the Egyptians out of Syria and out of Israel. So now it says here, Necho undertook a number of construction projects across his kingdom in his reign. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Necho II sent out an expedition of Phoenicians, as I talked about before in part one of ancient history. I told you guys the Phoenicians was there in Kemet. Plain and simple. They basically was the Egyptians. The Phoenicians, as I said, the purple people, name given by the Greeks, they were Egyptians. And there's other people who was basically there in Phoenicia to basically run that territory, because it's basically trade grounds. But it's telling you right here that he took the Phoenicians. These are Egyptians. It's just the name they use, the Greeks use, but they were down there, and they were, in Tyre, and we know Israel's along the way. They ruled Israel as well. This whole stretch of lands I talked about, ruled by ancient Egyptians. This is during the ancient Egyptian empire. They had control of this land. So it's saying Necho II set out an expedition of Phoenicians, which in 3 years sailed from the Red Sea around Africa to the mouth of the Nile. Now, this is the important part down here. They say Necho played a significant role in the histories of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Kingdom of Judah. Because, of course, they're going to throw that bullcrap in there. This is bullshit. I'm going to tell you why. Necho II is most likely the pharaoh mentioned in several books of the Bible. They could say that with no proof. Where's the proof of that? So, where's his name? They don't want to mention no more names because they already messed up with Ramses. That was a monumental mistake, put Ramses' name in there, knowing it's not going to add up. But it's real easy for them to just come out and say, well, he's the pharaoh probably mentioned in the Bible, to try to fit them in there. That's what it's about. Giving you enough to make it seem like they're telling the truth and that this stuff fits when it's all bogus. They could say anything. Where's the proof to back it up? He had nothing to do with this kingdom. But what they do is, since they understand it was turmoil around this time, it's not so much you can do to find proof. They interject people in these places. And this is one of the things that's weird when they try to interject Jews in servitude of the Egyptians, as if they work side by side. So to give us Jehoiakim, it says here, Jehoiakim was appointed by King Necho II, king of Egypt, in 608 BC. After Necho's return from the Battle of Haran, 3 months after he had killed King Josiah at Megiddo. Now, Jehoiakim was supposedly king of Judah, Judea, however you want to pronounce it. He was the king there. So it's highly unlikely that the Egyptians, Necho II, brought him in to basically rule while he was out at war. Why aren't y'all fighting alongside each other? What is he doing there? So again, this is they have to interject these people in to try to make it fit, to make it seem like, the Egyptians and the Greeks was just mingling in there together, but there's no proof of that. Plain and simple. They have to explain how they are in Israel during this time that the Egyptians are in power. And they're trying to make it like, well, they was in servitude to the Egyptians, basically working side by side. The Egyptians was appointing them to do stuff. But it's already giving you that hint when I was just explaining to you how you had, since they know, you had Samtek and you had Necho basically getting the Greeks to work with them. That's documented. That's something we can prove from Herodotus and the Egyptians themselves that says and attests to the fact the Greeks and the Egyptians was living alongside. Where is any mention of the Jews? So they had to put this in there. Well, it was the Egyptians, it was the Greeks and the Jews, but it's no mention of the Jews. But they got to explain for that. They have to explain that. They have to explain why and how they are there and in what capacity are they supposedly in Kemet during this time. There's no mention of them except for, bullshit like this. So now we're talking about the 6th century BCE. We know what's about to happen. We know eventually the Persians are going to come in there and take over Kemet from the Egyptians, right? So the whole question you have to ask yourself is, you have all these stories of the Jews in the Bible going out fighting these wars, conquering the whole nine. I just read to you how Necho II supposedly put a Jew in charge of basically running this area while he was out at war, giving you the hint that you had not only the Greeks working with the Egyptians, but the Jews as well in some capacity. So you would think it's a lot of them there. So the whole thing is, we know that the Persians came over. Now, according to the Jews, supposedly on their way to Kemet, to conquer Kemet, they stopped in Babylon, liberated the Jews. So they liberated the Jews, freed them, beat the Babylonians, came over to Israel, beat the Babylonians there. Now, maybe if it did really happen, which we know it didn't, maybe, you can say that the Persians told some of the Jews that, hey, we're going to Israel, whatever they called it back then, and go ahead and take that land from the Babylonians as well. Y'all should meet us up there, or what have you. But we don't know what the case was. But somehow, they made it up there. But the whole thing, again, is what you would have to explain. Well, there is no evidence or information that the Jews joined with the Persians to beat the Egyptians. They would like to have you believe that, so they can try to make it fit. Like, okay, well, maybe the Jews joined with the Persians since they freed them from Babylon and came up there and helped defeat the Egyptians. But that wouldn't make sense, because you would think they would have been strong enough to beat the Greeks, which they wasn't. Just remember what we have been talking about so far in this series, in the Ancient History series. Just looking at the fact that you have the Greeks who, as I've been showing you, have given us the doctrine, the Old Testament, New Testament, the Bible, and how they have been using their history to basically give us these stories in the Bible. And that when you go back and look, of course, you can't find any validity to the stories of the Hebrews, the Israelites, or what have you. But we do find with the Greeks this history. We find these stories that fits with their history, versus the fact that we can't find any biblical history on the Hebrews. This is important going forward, because we're going to show and see that once the Romans come in, that they basically do the same thing. Now, the main point in question would be the Jesus myth, and that's the whole thing. Everybody is willing to look past everything in the New Testament and really not really pay so much attention to the rest of the book. But when it comes to Jesus, this person, did he exist? And, to me, it's just crazy. And it's, you could put Jesus on the same level as Moses, 500 years old, spending 100 years to build an ark. So it's the same type of stuff to me. So it has to be looked at. And the main thing is, you have people, supposedly people, pseudepigrapha, when you think about it, you have supposedly people coming forward, giving us these gospels about the so-called life of Jesus Christ. All, suspect things that are in question that we have to look at and examine to determine, what's the truth. Now, again, as I said, just as we went back and looked at Greek history, we can see it correspond with the Bible and fit Greeks, no Jews. It's going to be the same thing in the New Testament. And it's not a coincidence that it's written in Greek. Plain and simple. You got to pay attention to this stuff. How is it that for this long stretch, you have supposedly this Hebrew language that becomes a dead language, which we'll get into that. And then you have the injection of this totally new doctrine, totally new concepts called Christianity, that comes and takes place right after this huge war of Rome and the so-called Jews. So, it's so much in question. There's so much that is suspect around this time frame that you got to take a look at it to get the truth. It can't really be just accepted, by this book, by just, taking the Bible and just, saying it's completely true. We have to continue to put it into context with actual history and see where it fits. And does it fit? Nowhere. And that's the thing. So we're going to start to dig into this and take a look. So now, talked about this in the previous video about how you had during this time. And we're talking about, right around the time before the War of the Jews. You have still, supposedly in the Jewish doctrine, this whole, prophecy of a warrior Messiah coming forth and helping the Jews defeat the Romans. Because you have, according to their history, you have during this time the persecution of Jews, Jews being enslaved and Jews being basically, oppressed and, trying to live a normal life. They're being overtaxed by Rome and things are just, outrageous. So the Jews had repeated, skirmishes with the Romans to where you had a lot of young Jews rise up and try to take on the Romans and was defeated. Stuff like this kept happening over and over again. Now, you have you got to understand, one, you have this whole hatred, this whole animosity with the Jews and the Romans. So, when you have Jesus coming in and his doctrine just doesn't fit with that time frame, as I talked about, it just doesn't fit, where you would have supposedly a Jew walking around Galilee and, Jerusalem, preaching, turn the other cheek, preaching to love thy neighbor, preaching. Remember, Jesus says, render to Caesar all things that is basically Caesar, basically pay your taxes. None of this kind of talk would have fit in with the Jews around this time. They would not have tolerated anybody talking like that. They probably would have thought that that person was a spy. So it's far-fetched that, Jesus will be walking around in Jerusalem, Galilee, or what have you, in Israel, preaching this kind of doctrine for so long, and during a time when there was so much war going on between the Jews and the Romans. So this has a history to it. It's a lot to this point that you have to understand. It's basically going back to the War of the Diadochi. So you have with the Seleucid Empire, remember they took over the territory, which part of it would be Israel. Now you have the Hasmoneans, which we know as the Maccabees, basically rise up and fight for their independence, and they would get it around 163, 164 BCE up until about 63, 64 BCE, where they were basically reconquered. Rome came in and took over and re-obtained those lands that the Greeks once owned. And, Rome took over, and all the fight and everything that the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, or what have you, done been through, all the fighting was basically, for naught. They had to basically start over again and deal with a whole new, even worse regime than the Greeks. So, Rome came in, took over, and basically set them back. And they was dealing with the oppression of Rome, since then. So now who was in Israel around this time still? This is the 2nd century BCE. You still have a lot of Africans in Israel. You have a mixed group now because during this time you had a lot of Edomites or Arabs coming in to Israel, coming into those lands. You have basically now the mixing. You have Greek, you have African, you have Arab in and out of this town, of this place. So it's the same thing. When you go back and look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics, when they showed you who the citizens of Egypt was everybody. You had white, you had African, you had Arab. You can see clear as day how they presented them. This was basically what it looked like throughout, with the so-called Middle East, with the majority before conquest being African people. And that's something that we know. So the rulers or the people that was in power or the main majority of the land and everything belonged to us, of course. And we were in power, of course, until we were conquered. So you have all that going on. So they got to remember around the time when these wars are happening with the Greeks and then the Romans and the Arabs and everything, the Africans are slowly trickling out of Israel down into lower Africa and other places. And it will eventually be overrun by Arabs and the Greeks or what have you, which would, give us the Berbers and everything like that. So important to note that. So now history notes the fact that you have these Arabs coming in. They call them the foreigners from Edom, which Edom would be in Arabia. So we're talking about Arabs here. So what would happen, you would have a lot of these Arab groups come in and take over smaller lands from the people, from African people. And what they didn't know was a lot of these lands was controlled by Rome, and Rome didn't care who was living on the land. They taxed the people that was there. So they would come in and basically tax the Arabs, who basically had no clue when they set out to conquer that Rome was taxing these people. So this is where basically Antipater comes in. And Antipater was basically an Edomite or Arab who his family had converted to Judaism. And he would basically get into politics and basically try to pick up where the Maccabees and, everybody who was, having a problem with Rome, he would basically fit in with the politics of that time, what the Maccabees was talking about, and everybody who had an issue with the taxation of Rome, he would appeal to those people. But at the same time, he was playing both sides. He was also, kissing Rome's ass and doing what they wanted them to do. So he knew how to play both parts so well that, Julius Caesar basically appointed him as procurator of Judea in 47 BCE. And Caesar basically, had him keeping the people in line. Now, later, his son will basically become governor. We know him as Herod. Herod will be king by the time that Jesus is, born and died. So you have this history connection right up front already of Rome having connections with the Arabs. It's important to establish this early, that you have a Roman Caesar who is working with Arabs during this time, because this just makes sense as we go forward. So you have Antipater comes in, he plays both sides, as I said, he moves up in rank, and his son becomes governor, and this is kind of sort of basically what we see them do. Same thing as you'll see later on with Spain, is when Rome comes in and assumes power, they never put their people in that position. They always use the people who they conquered to control the people. So it's the same type of MO. We have gotten to this point by going through, so many different instances in history that we see with the Greeks and their conquests, beginning with the conquest of ancient Egypt, and seeing how they basically came into power. And, more than most people, when you look at this series, I have given you a good, comprehensive review and, probably an accurate history of what happened to the ancient Egyptians. And I consider it to be more accurate than most of the stuff that's out there. A lot of people is not really talking to us about what took place and how the Europeans came into power, of course, because they don't want to admit, exactly what was done to us. But looking at this history and looking at what we have been talking about so far, we can see clearly exactly what happened and how the Europeans rose to power and what happened to ancient Kemet and what basically happened to us. So in this video right here, this DVD, we really have to look at the King James Version and what was it for, because I don't think a lot of people realize how major of a role it played, and not just what happened to the slaves and the justification of slavery, but, up until today. And how we see in every facet today, we have this Christian doctrine and these Christian beliefs and values that's basically in our life. So to really understand what took place in the history of it, we got to go through it and look at, its place and how it got to where it is. And to get people to understand that, biblical religion was not, organized religion, I should say, was not what people think it is today. It's a lot of fighting going on. It's a lot of people who did not agree. There was a lot of stuff that people didn't take into consideration as far as how could we get to this point with religion being this dominant force, Christianity mainly being this dominant force in the world today. It was a lot that had to happen, a lot that the popes had to do and put in place to get them to the point of power that they are today.
So again, you have the inception of the book beginning with the Greeks and the Septuagint, plain and simple. There's nobody nowhere that can prove anything prior to that as having a biblical manuscript before this point. And it was given to us by the Greeks. So that's laid out. That's another thing that is established. So now we got to move forward and look at that history as I already talked about. We're not going to go into all that and really get up to the point where everything is starting to really, take place, where you have Rome basically coming in and conquering, and then you have them basically continuing Hellenization for a very important reason. Now, we know that reason was because of control, power. They had so many people under this influence of this religion that they continued that and the spreading of it, plain and simple. So again, you just ask yourself the simple, basic question. If Hellenization, because you're going to have this argument, if Hellenization was about the Greeks spreading all this, Zeus religion and, all this Greek mythology religion or what have you,
how come it didn't stick throughout, any of these countries? In fact, you have Judaism that did stick because this is what they were spreading and not Egyptian or Greek mythology, I should say. So they continued it to keep the power going, to keep that going, because they had their own plans, obviously. And the reason why we have Christianity later, as I said, is because that backfired with the whole war, the Jewish war. So it's not a coincidence that we have, the Greeks and the original Torah written in Greek, not Hebrew. As I said, we never found the Hebrew Torah or what have you. So we have that in Greek with the Septuagint, as well as the Old Testament, New Testament being in Greek as well because of the Greeks. So you have one of the key pieces to this whole puzzle is Dr. Joseph Yehuda's book, Hebrew is Greek, on how he proved that the Greeks created the Hebrew language. So I'm going to read from this here. It says, Mr. Yehuda claims that overwhelming evidence proves conclusively that Biblical Hebrew is camouflaged Greek. Biblical Hebrew is camouflaged Greek in grammar as well as vocabulary, and that by and large the difference between them is a matter of pronunciation. So much so that the Hebrew cannot be properly understood except through Greek, and that Greek may be better understood through Hebrew. The camouflage or mask, which conceals the identity of Hebrew with Greek, has a code, and Mr. Yehuda has broken the cipher and formulated rules of decoding, the accuracy of which can be tried over and over again. And that means when you keep doing it, it's going to keep giving you the same result. Stripped of this camouflage and allowing for differences of pronunciation, the words of both languages reveals their identity with each other. And the result, many obscure words and puzzling passages become clear, and the biblical vocabulary is vastly enriched. It emerges from his vast and meticulous physiological research that the Hebrews were of Hellenic descent. Now, he would say that because of this language, meaning that they had to be some kind of Greek, Hellenic descent, and that they were both intimately related to the Greeks by religion and custom, that the traditional segregation of the Indo-European from the so-called Semitic languages is baseless, that a considerable revision of our amount of the Jewish and Arab people is required, and that the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures, the triple pillars of modern civilization, have a common Hellenic foundation. And as I said, he has also proven that Arabic as well was created by the Greeks. Clear as day, their foundation begins with Greek. And one of the things, I've been talking about this book for years, and if you have a copy, you're lucky because they are gone. Go and try to find you a copy right now. Remember, I was showing you pictures before of this book being on Amazon for sale, and how it rose from $700 all the way up to $7,000 before now it disappeared. Somebody has meticulously went out, searched through the internet, and bought every single copy because I had links to other books. Luckily for me, I got myself 2 copies before they're gone now. You can't buy a copy. Find a copy, see if you can buy one. Not to mention the genocide of African tribes and people all over, the planet. So when we talk about this colonial conquest, this conquest of the Europeans, what does it really all entails? And I don't really think you can find too many places that put it all together. Well, not in video, but books, of course. But it's a history that must be understood, because then people can understand who they are by connecting these dots and why they are where they are at. And that's really speaking to the people of South America and understanding, how you got there, and who the indigenous people of these lands really are and what real history is talking about. So we get into this thing, and talked about before how we had this whole argument about Africans selling, other Africans into slavery. And I showed you guys, if you are a member of Merkabah Academy, I put the video up there about King Barobansu, who the Dutch cut his head off because he wouldn't sell out to the Europeans and sell people into slavery. This is what happened. So when people are talking about us selling each other into slavery, as I said this before, they don't understand. These kings, these rulers were forced to do so. They were forced to go and hunt down their enemies and enslave them or risk their own people being enslaved, so on and so forth. You had some people that was willing to do so, others were not, and he wasn't willing to do this, so they cut off his head. And, as I talked about in the video, they preserved his head. They pickled his head, preserved it for over, 200 years. You have the Netherlands basically returning the head to the people, and, they basically have this whole understanding, of the history of a man who lost his head to try to save his own people, a history that should be taught and a lot of people should know. But bigger than that, they should have the understanding of this was the pressure that rulers faced when it was faced with the decision of slavery, enslaving their own people or not. But we get into this history. And as I said before, it wasn't about slavery. It wasn't about capturing slaves to have free labor in America. This was about conquest. This was about conquest, one, and hiding every facet of African intelligence, sophistication, accomplishments, and everything that we did back in the ancient world, completely destroying all of that, getting rid of all information, all knowledge of what we did and what we were able to do before the rise of the European powers. And this is what they have effectively done. So let's start with Benin. Talked about Benin and the many hidden accomplishments of African people on YouTube. But it says here, at the end of the 13th century, when the first European travelers encountered the great Benin city in West Africa, present Nigeria, he wrote, "The town seems to be very great. When you enter it, you go into a great broad street not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoed Street in Amsterdam. The king's palace is a collection of buildings. There are numerous apartments for the princes, ministers, and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the exchange in Amsterdam. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide. The houses are arranged in good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that they are polished and shining like a looking glass. But sadly, in 1897, Benin City was destroyed by the British forces under Admiral Harry Rawson. The city was looted, blown up, and burnt to the ground." Now, one of the things you'll see as we go through this, and you'll see if you've been digging through history, they made it a primary objective, a main point, to destroy everything, burn down the cities completely, destroy it, blow up what they could, reduce it to rubble. As I've shown you guys, a lot of the ruins still remain, but to make it as if these people, they had no cities. It wasn't as beautiful and marvelous as we just read, that these people just had nothing and they buried cities. Like, it's so much hidden in Africa that a lot of people don't understand that's underground, and the people who have the knowledge of it is dead and gone. And we're not going to really know until later, exploration is done about these cities that's buried, because they blew them to pieces and they buried, everything that was left, the remnants, the ruins. They even took the time to do that, to not leave the ruins in certain places. And it's far from them coming in and wanting slaves to come to America or go to Europe and do, slave labor. It's deeper than that. They wanted to completely hide anything that showed sophistication and education from African people that predates them, which is what, we've seen in Africa. But let's look at this Admiral Sir Harry Holdsworth Rawson. It says, I just want to read here real quick. It says, Admiral Sir Harry Holdsworth Rawson was a senior officer in the Royal Navy. He is chiefly remembered for overseeing the British Benin expedition, and this is how they call it, the expedition, the damn expedition, it's genocide, of 1897 that burned and looted the city of the Kingdom of Benin, now in Nigeria. No shame was attached to the event at the time, which amounted to a punitive expedition, and Rawson was appointed governor of New South Wales, serving from 27 May 1902 to 27 May 1909. So he basically got promoted for what he did. We know the same thing happened with the Ashanti tribe. They went to war with the Europeans and they lost and had, a lot of their cities and their towns and their villages or what have you burnt and destroyed. But we see this with Harry Rawson. we know about King Leopold and the whole thing with the Congolese people in the Belgian Congo. He killed over 10 million African people. 10 million Africans. He's credited with this, and it's something that that's just known. Over 10 million people. I mean, that's enough people to fill every NFL stadium in America 3 times. And think about that. Every single NFL stadium, you could fill it 3 times. That's how many people this man killed. You also have General von Trotha, who was responsible for the Namibian people's genocide of the Herero tribe. These people went to war with him from 1904 to 1907, and they lost once, of course, they came with the guns, and it was a complete massacre after that. But we have, 3. We can keep going down the line with this. These European generals we're going to keep seeing coming into African territories, completely destroying the people and walking out of there with gold or what have you and everything else and keeping it moving. This is what they destroyed. They didn't really care about the tribal people, which is why they still are allowed to live and survive today, because they're tribal. They're not trying to build major cities or trying to really be leaders in, agriculture or trade or what have you, like these cities was doing. It was leading the world, and everybody was coming from around the world to come trade and learn from the Africans. These were the people who they targeted for destruction, and this is what they was doing. But then we understand what happened with the Tasmanian people. A lot of people don't know that whole story. But you had, for a long time, Tasmanian people been around for 40,000 years. And once the flood happened, it was a flood that basically brought a lot of sickness to the Tasmanian people, and their numbers started to decline. Their numbers started to go down. And the land it was on, the island of Tasmania, they wanted the land, of course. They came in there, they've been trying to get it for a long time, and they was wiping the people out before they admit. But you had, in 1833, George Augustus Robinson, who was sponsored by Lieutenant Governor George Arthur. So George Robinson seen that, the Tasmanian people numbers basically went down to like 200. And they wanted the land so bad they didn't want to wait till these 200 people died or try to kill the last remaining 200 people. So he basically got funding. And he took the 200 people from Tasmanian Island to northeast of Tasmanian Island to a small island called Flanders Island or something like that. Flinders Island. And about 14 years later, from 200 Tasmanian people, was like 47 left. Then 45 of those people died, and it was 2 left that they transferred to Oyster Island, where they later died. So you had the complete genocide. These people wiped out so that they can take the island of Tasmania from these people. Now, the reason why they agreed to basically follow, this general was because he was a preacher. He was a religious person. It was somebody who they knew, they was familiar with, that they let come in, and once people started dying off, they didn't really understand. It probably was, chemical warfare, or they released some kind of, sickness onto the people, and they started dying off. It's the same thing if we go back and look at what happened with the Herero people and the Ashanti, who they basically, they didn't want white people in there. And they were still naive about it because you had white people coming in who was peaceful and was helping out and was teaching, but they didn't realize that they was, infiltrators. So now when we look at the world, when we look at history, most people are in agreement that something is wrong. Something that's not right about the history, as we know it. And as we went through in our ancient history series, we can see why that things have been changed in the favor of the conquerors, and our accomplishments and the people who are the original man, our rulership, our kingdoms, everything that we was before them has been, hidden. But, we look at this reality, and we got to realize that reality, the society, the way that it is today, has been shaped to be this way. It was shaped to be exactly what it is, to be basically in opposition to real freedom. If you look at everything, true freedom is a farce. True freedom don't really exist because we have all these statutes and codes and laws and rules, which is understandable in a society because you got to have laws and rules. But these things are stuff that's beyond, normal laws. These laws and codes and statutes are specifically designed to limit true freedom. And the entertainment is designed to basically destroy spirituality. And this is what's going on. So, if you think back in the day, as I always talk about, the people were much smarter back then. We have our Steve Jobs and our Zuckerbergs and Bill Gates and what have you, and a lot of the smart people of the 20th century who, when you really pay attention, a lot of the stuff that they invented and brought out possibly was stolen or it pre-existed, and it just was the time for it to come out. But no matter how you want to slice it, it was created within a system, a structure that was designed to be what it is, to be exactly what it is, to whatever comes out of it is fine because it's controlled. You understand what I'm saying? It don't matter what you do or what you create or what your invention may be. We control it. We run it. And people, further back were much smarter, more free. And even the Zuckerbergs and, Steve Jobs and everybody, they have the physicists and the old, scientists and everybody to thank for their accomplishments that basically paved the way for these guys to be as smart as they are, because without them, they wouldn't be where they at. And largely, a lot of the information is due to, quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and what we pull from that to give us, what we see today. So still got to go back and see that those people before us were smarter than us to give us what we have. But when you put it in context to this system, this how it was supposed to go. This is the plan. And we may look at it as these people coming out with stuff, but they are allowed to do this. And, it's funny how you have a Zuckerberg come out and you have Facebook, and how Facebook now consumes, the planet, and it's in control of, our social status and everything that we do as far as the way we interact with each other now. Social media has basically taken over. And you shouldn't be surprised to see that the government has an aspect in Facebook. They have their hand in social media. It's control. So now you got facial recognition. You have, them knowing your information, where you live, your friends, so on and so forth. And it's all control, and they're gathering information and creating algorithms to basically track people and figure out their patterns and what they do, so on and so forth. It's countless cases that have been solved because of Facebook. We all know this. So you got to look at all this. And you got to understand, as I always talk about, if you're going to create a society that's going to be based on control, a controlled society, you have to control every single aspect of it. And these people got smarter, from the ancient times, Middle Ages, to where it was really not too much to occupy the people. The people had time to basically think and ponder. And if stuff wasn't right, if people wasn't eating, they was coming right at the leadership. So whereas today, we have distractions, we have excuses, we have a system in place. It's going to make a lot of sense, because you got to understand, okay, if you follow this system, then you were supposed to be able to do this. You understand? So you went to school and you learned and you studied, and you went to university and you learned and you studied, and you spent all these years doing exactly what they told you to do. Then you should be here. You should have this kind of money. But then, we look at it as, okay, we have entertainment as a distraction. We have poverty as a distraction. So we may have made bad decisions based upon these things, which put us in a position where we're at, which is not where we want to be. So we don't look at society as saying it's their fault. We look at ourselves and we say, well, I got to do better. I said this before about homeless people. You got to understand what put them in that position, especially black homeless people, because poverty and bad decisions and choices that we could only make within this society, we made because this was the only choices we could make that led to where we are. So you follow the rules, you follow the programming, what they put out there, and you do everything the way they want you to do it, you could possibly be successful. And that's the thing. And if you become successful, then you are aiding into the control system, the whole structure of the society. You're aiding in that. And then you're becoming one of them and still not functioning outside of the system that they created. Thus, the freedom you think you have and the wealth you think you have and everything you think you're doing, that you're balling, it's a part of the control. And there is no choice. Choice is an illusion created by the system. Now, you think you had the choice to do this, but everything was put here for you to choose from, for you to pick from, and for you to create whatever reality that you think is yours, whatever freedom you think you have, no matter what they gave you, and no matter what you chose, it's from the system, and you're aiding the system in anything that you do. Think about that.